Welcome everyone to the Department of Justice's webinar, Fiscal Year 2019 CTAS Financial Management Budget Development Presentation. My name is Christina and I will be your moderator for today. It is my pleasure to turn things over to the subject matter experts from the Department of Justice. Your presenters today will be Bill Faith, Michael Williams, James Smith, and Donna Simmons.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Williams and I'm from the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. Welcome to the budget development presentation for the CTAS fiscal year 2019 presentation. I again will be one of your presenters along with Bill Faith and Donna Simmons. What I would like to do in getting started is to give you an overview of what we're talking about when we're talking about a budget review or overview. What we're looking at is that creating your budget, you're coming up with a plan of the goals and objectives for the upcoming year for your particular program. So it's very important that you think this process through in order to determine that you are actually specifying all the resources that you're going to need for the upcoming year. So with that, information for the 2019 solicitation can be found at the following justice.gov tribal website. Information that you can find in there is the 2019 solicitation, which is important. Also, you can find the sample budget detail worksheet and narrative to use. Allowable costs and unallowable costs. I encourage you to look at this document to determine what costs are allowable or unallowable under these particular programs, because what you would like to do is avoid your application being returned or held up for unallowable costs also included in your application. Most important, I am a big person who uses acronyms a lot. I'll try to refrain from using them in this particular presentation, but also you'll be able to find common acronyms that's used by DOJ as a whole. So with that, we're going to talk about the budget categories. Here's what I really want you to keep in mind in reference to this particular slide here. Although your organization may have different budget categories that you use within your organization, for the DOJ application, we require that you use these particular budget categories when filling out your applications. So for example, personnel, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, supplies, subawards and contracts, the other category, and indirect costs. Again, these are the required budget categories that you need to use when you submit your application for approval. Now, I would like to go through each budget category to give you an idea of the information that we are looking for in order to help you prepare a more winning application in order to not have it to be returned. So let's start off with the personnel category. There are some items that we're looking for within the application. So as you can see, position, title, percentage of time, the compensation, and any increases that may come during that particular application time. Now, some people will put a particular name for the position. If you do not have a specific name, it's very important that at a minimum you do list the position. And you can always worry about the actual person that's going to work on that particular program at a later date. One thing to keep in mind, though, when we're talking about positions, those key personnel that have been approved on that particular program, when we change out key personnel, it's very important that you contact the program office and let them know of those particular changes in key personnel. So again, it's very important that at a minimum we get this type of information. So if we're talking about compensation, we normally like to see it explained out in an annual salary and based on the percentage of time that that person will be working on this particular program, then you can calculate it out based on that. Down the bottom, it's always important that costs must be necessary for the program, reasonable, allowable, and again, remember I said that you can find allowable costs and unallowable costs on the website, and allocable. And what I mean when I talk about allocable, based on a federal grant program, these costs should be treated consistently within your organization. Here is what the personnel category should basically look like based on the individual or the position that is going to be working on this particular program, the salary, Here you see the rate. So whether we're talking about, and where I talked about annual salary, you want to make sure that it's based on an annual salary. And then once you put in this information, the fantastic thing about this budget worksheet is that it automatically calculates for you. So we have reduced the possibility of errors being calculated on this particular application. Most important, the budget narrative. Now, the budget narrative, I believe, is a very important component of any application. Based on the previous slide, and there are amounts in there or items in there that I really can't understand, I normally would go to the budget narrative to try to get additional detail in reference to the items that I might have questions about. So I think it's very important that you provide as much information in the budget narrative, because it also helps to avoid an application from being sent back to your organization requesting that additional information. Here is where you're listing the fringe benefits with your particular organization that are allowed for people that work on your particular program. The most important thing that I want to stress here is back when I was talking about personnel and the percentage of time that they are working on any grant program, the thing to keep in mind is that if a person is only working part-time on your particular program and they're only part-time with the organization, they will probably end up with less fringe benefits than a full-time person. So keep that in mind. And the other thing that we like to see is those fringe benefits spelled out. For example, here's what I'm talking about. Let's just say that the fringe benefits rate for your organization is 35%. But I would like to see what that entire 35% is all inclusive of. So we would like for you to break those things out like FICA, health insurance, retirement, or workers' comp. And then most important, no unallowable costs in fringe benefits. The example that I'm giving here is excessive fringe benefits for executives. But again, when I talk about unallowable fringe benefits, I'll give you an example of something that I saw. Is that in one particular application, a grantee had underfunded their benefit program. So when I looked at the rate, it appeared to be extremely high. So when I asked for a breakdown of that information, the information that was sent to me, I was able to detect that they had underfunded their pension plan in previous years, and they were going to use the grant program this year to catch up. So it's important that you break out this information so that I can look at it to see what's all inclusive, along with determining whether or not the rate appears to be excessive. Again, looking at the actual detailed worksheet, all of the information in reference to your fringe benefits are listed based on the base, salaries, or whatever the actual base may be. The actual rates for each one, FICA, workman's comp, based on putting in the amount. Again, like I said, the system will automatically calculate these amounts for you. And then be mindful, based on the narrative, if there are certain things that you think that I may need to know, or the reviewer will need to know in reference to anything in reference to the fringe benefits, please take the time in the narrative to provide that additional information. Travel is something that we all look at very closely, okay? Based on the components that you have in here, the most important thing in order for me to make any determination in reference to the travel category is I need to determine what travel policy that you're using. In most cases, we always encourage grantees to have their own travel policy. And a result that you do not have your own travel policy, you must follow the federal guidelines. So when we're dealing with the travel category, there are things to look at. The computation, the number of people that's going to be traveling, most importantly, the purpose of the actual travel. The per diem rate that's being used, and again, remember I said if you don't have your own travel policy, we're looking for you to follow the federal guidelines. Transportation and any other travel that's associated with that. One thing that I want to stress when we're talking about the travel category for things that you need to keep in mind is sometimes a program will have a requirement that you attend certain types of training. Similar to this one, but the good thing about this one, it's a webinar, so there's no travel associated with it. But in some cases, they require you to travel. And in the solicitation, it may have the acronym TBD, to be determined. So if you have to come up with travel costs for something to be determined at a future date, it's very important that you take into consideration the possibility of where you might be traveling to. And I'll give you an example. Let's just say that there is a training to be determined and you're on the West Coast. I think the best course of action for coming up with an estimate for travel is to factor that travel on the East Coast or the other side of the United States. That will also allow you flexibility in your budget category if the travel happens to be mid-state or in mid-part of the United States. So, for example, Texas or something like that. So again, when you're dealing with to be determined, you really have to come up with an estimate, and hopefully that you are estimating something that will cover all of the to be determined travel in the future. Again, I'll stress based on the bottom bullet, its cost must be necessary, reasonable, allocable, and allowable for the grant program. Again, based on the actual detailed budget worksheet, once you put these items in its respective place, based on the cost that you're dealing with and the duration or the mileage or anything that's associated with travel, once you put this information in there based on its cost, the system will automatically calculate it for you. And again, narrative, based on certain things that I may be looking at in the travel category. If you think that I may not have a full picture of those particular costs, again, utilize the narrative section of the budget in order to explain these things to me that you think that I may find them to be a little vague. Here is something in reference to OJP funded contracts. Based on an OJP funded contract, if you are a recipient that is going to be hosting an event, the OJP requirement says that if there are 30 or more participants, and the key here is participants, that lodging must be provided for any number of attendees at the federal per diem rate. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about when I say this. So when I use the word 30 or more and I use participants, in some cases, participants are from the area where you're hosting this event at. So if there are 30 more participants and only 1 or 2 participants will require lodging, those 1 or 2 participants will need to have the federal lodging rate for that particular area where you're at. Now, for conferences or events with federal funding that are less than 30, you are exempt from this particular requirement. And keep in mind that this is an OJP requirement. Information in reference to lodging can be found on the GSA website, and we do periodically update the DOJ financial guide, so that's another source that you can use to find information about lodging and per diem rates. Based on equipment, let me say this. The idea for equipment is to use equipment, if allowed to be purchased with the grant program, for as long as you have a need for that particular equipment. Most importantly, you should follow your own policy and procedures in reference to equipment, okay? Just because you have a federal grant, you do not have to change any of your policy and procedures, but continue to use your own. In identifying equipment, I normally say that you want to break equipment down to its lowest component. So I'll give you an example of what I mean when I say the lowest component. Let's just take an employee's workstation that consists of laptop, screen, mouse, other things associated with that equipment. Together as one unit, that equipment may be in excess of $5,000, $10,000. However, if we were to separate out equipment, the mouse, the screen, the keyboard, all of those items should never be higher than $5,000 if we break it down to its lowest component. So I encourage you to the point that you can, and I'll explain to you why I'm saying that on the next slide. But I encourage you to, when you are dealing with equipment, break it out to its lowest component. The other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about equipment is that most award programs are annual programs. So there may not be a need to actually purchase equipment, but lease equipment. So one of the things that you want to do if your application is to purchase equipment is you want to be able to submit a comparison that you've done showing the value or the reason why you want to purchase equipment as opposed to leasing equipment, okay? And any equipment, there should be justification as to how it's going to be used in your particular program and the actual need for it. So when I think of equipment using the federal definition, it is equipment that has a useful life of more than 1 year and a fair market value of $5,000 or more. Again, use equipment for as long as you have a need for it, even if the grant program is no longer in existence. Once you no longer have a need for that particular equipment, the disposition requirements is that if you no longer need it for criminal justice purposes, there are two things that we want to look at to determine whether or not you have any recourse back to the federal government. So let's look at the first one. If the fair market value is less than $5,000 for that particular equipment, you can retain that equipment with no further obligations back to the awarding agency. Additional information can be found in the Uniform Guidance 200.313, Item 5E. Now, if the fair market value is $5,000 or more, and like I said, you can continue to use it for criminal justice purposes, but if it's more than $5,000 and you no longer have a need for it, there are a couple things that you can do. It's not listed on this slide, but if there's another federal grant program that you could transfer that equipment to for a similar criminal justice purposes, that is one option. If not, then it needs to be sold. You want to reach out to the federal awarding agency, ask them for disposition requirements. Most cases, we will tell you to sell the equipment because the federal government isn't in the business of housing assets or equipment. So after you sell the equipment, the federal proceeds should be refunded to the awarding agency. Now, at this time, I will turn the presentation over to Donna Simmons because she would like to explain to you some special requirements for the Violence Against Women's Grants Program in reference to equipment. Donna?
Thank you, Michael. Hi, I'm Donna with the Office of Violence Against Women. I'm the Associate Director. I want to talk to you a little bit about the equipment. So for computing devices such as your computers, cell phones, those type of equipment items should be placed in supplies. They are no longer considered a piece of equipment. So when you put your budget together and if you're purchasing a computer, please be sure to put that in supplies. And if you're going to consider purchasing a vehicle because you need it for the services you will provide under your OVW grant program, please be sure to include a lease versus purchase comparable on your vehicles. Provide a brief analysis that compares the cost, demonstrating the most effective and measures for purchasing that vehicle. And if the lease is selected, please be sure to make sure the cost is allocated in the sub-award procurement contract category instead of equipment if it's going to be leased. That's all I have, Michael.
Thank you, Donna. So again, based on the budget worksheet, based on the equipment that you will place in these items, the number of items and the cost, remember I said that the system will automatically calculate it for you. And then, as I've stated throughout the presentation, please do not forget about providing a narrative. This additional information will help the analyst determine how best to move forward with approving this item in this particular category. Now, supplies are normally those items that will be expensed within 1 year, okay? When I was talking about equipment, I talked about separating out individual units. That is not necessarily the case when we're talking about supplies. So you can group supply items together. So say, for example, office, training supplies, or postage. The thing that I want to caution you on when you group items in this particular category is, let's say, for example, postage is for $1,000. Now, I may think that that is excessive without the proper justification as to why it's so high. So again, based on the narrative, I would look for something that would possibly say that postage is $1,000 for the year because we'll be sending out newsletters or other types of communications to the community, either monthly, quarterly, and these are the number of people within the community that we'll be sending it to. With that additional information, it helps me to visualize why the postage category of $1,000 is high. When we're talking about supplies, how the supplies will support the efforts with the particular program. And then again, like I said, all the detailed information in the budget narrative to help me make a determination as to the reasonableness of those supplies when we group them together. Again, looking at the detailed budget worksheet, we're going to list out supplies, the items that we need, its cost, and the system will automatically calculate this section for us. Let me say this in reference to construction, because construction is normally not allowed with grant programs. However, under Purpose Area 4 in the past, construction was an allowable cost. So I'll go down to the notes section first and work my way back up. Based on Purpose Area 4, new construction is no longer allowed, but renovations and expansions and prefab facilities are now allowable costs under Purpose Area number 4. However, I will caution you when we're doing renovations, basic drywall, repair, painting, flooring, plumbing, whatever the case is, I would caution you to contact the program office first and go over what you're actually considering renovation, because based on the uniform requirements, the 2 CFR, capital assets or renovating this particular structure, it may be considered a capital asset in reference to changing or altering the value and or useful life of the structure. So before we get into any types of renovation, I would run that information past the program office before I start that work. So if renovation will be allowed, then the purpose of it needs to be justified in reference to the narrative. Then again, based on the actual worksheet, we're going to put all of that information in reference to renovation, its cost, and again, based on the narrative, we're going to explain what we're actually doing. And again, the idea is to not materially increase the value of the structure or its useful life. Section G, or subawards and procurement. This is a section that really needs to be looked at carefully, because we don't want to have an entity that's truly a subaward or subrecipient listed as a procurement contract, okay? So the difference between the two is if I'm dealing with a subaward or subrecipient, that entity will be providing a vital part of that particular grant program. So for an example, let's just say that the solicitation in my application says that I am going to do X, Y, and Z. However, your organization can only successfully perform X and Y. You will reach outside of your organization to find another entity to perform this component of that particular grant program. If an entity is performing any aspect of the grant program, that makes them a subrecipient. When we're talking about procurement contracts, what we're talking about, for example, is let's just say that I need laptops in order to keep track of various things for this particular grant program. So I am going to contract with, let's say, Dell for these laptops that I need. Dell will not be performing any aspects of the grant program, which makes this a procurement agreement and not a sub-award and sub-recipient type of agreement. Also, when we're dealing with procurements, we have to be mindful of consultant rates. The current threshold is $650 for DOJ, but here's what I want to make you mindful of. A consultant should be paid what they are worth and not what the federal threshold is. So what I mean by that, if a consultant is worth $900 a day, then he or she should be paid $900 a day. The deal is in order to exceed the $650 threshold, you need prior approval. Based on the justification that you're going to be submitting to the awarding agency are multiple contracts, more than one, from the consultant saying or validating that that is their daily rate. Sole source justification. The contract over $250,000. Again, I'm not saying that you cannot make a sole source contract, but if you do, and the amount is $250,000 or more, you must reach out to the awarding agency to get prior approval prior to entering into that particular contract. Additional information about procurement standards can be also found in the Uniform Guidance, subsection 317 through 326. And again, based on that particular category, if you look at this section here, based on subawards or subrecipients and procurement, all of that information would go in this section. And again, the system will automatically calculate those numbers for you. So again, I'm going to stress the importance of the narrative. All of the information in reference to subrecipients to give the reviewer additional information or the procurement can be put in this section here. Now, the other category, I normally like to say that if it did not fit neatly in the categories that we just talked about, then naturally it must go into the other category. Being in the other category, the rules are still the same. I still need that detailed information about whatever that other category is. So for example, if we're talking about rent, that information is also put in here. In most cases, what might help to justify the cost is the square footage and other information in reference to that particular rent, or whatever other item, whether it's phone, anything else. Again, additional information as to how these numbers are justified is important to put in this particular section here. So when we're looking again at the budget worksheet, placed on all of the items that need to be put in there, their total cost, the system will automatically calculate it for you. Indirect cost is something that can be charged back against a grant program. If your organization has an approved indirect cost agreement, that is a requirement for the submission of your grant program from its cognizant federal agency. The thing to keep in mind, if your indirect cost rate has expired, you cannot reimburse yourself for indirect costs on the grant program until you get a new approved indirect cost rate. There are various types of rates out there, as you can see down the bottom, so you want to know which type of rates you have or that you're receiving from your cognizant federal agency. Another thing that the Uniform Guidance did provide to grant recipients is that they understood all of the requirements for getting a federally negotiated indirect cost rate. So the uniform requirements came up with what they called a de minimis rate. It's a rate that you can elect to charge back against grant programs based on a few requirements. One is that your organization must have never had a federally approved indirect cost rate in the past. So I don't mean that it has been expired for the last 10, 15 years. You must have never had a federally approved indirect cost rate. The de minimis rate that they're allowing is a 10% de minimis rate. This rate is based on the modified total direct cost. And when I say modified total direct cost, this rate has to be modified, or the items within the pool have to be modified or taken out. So, for example, one of the items in the modified total direct cost that you would take out of this pool would be equipment. The thing about the de minimis rate is that the charges that you're charging against this program must be consistent. So normally in my organization, if something is considered an indirect cost, for the grant purposes within my organization, that's an indirect cost. So you can't go back and forth treating costs differently. And again, I'll stress this again, costs must be necessary, reasonable, allowable, and allocable. So based on the worksheet, this information in reference to indirect costs is placed in this section. And based on the narrative, based on the rate that you're using and whether or not it is current, is some information that you can provide down in the narrative section. So when you're all done, based on going through each category, your budget summary should look something like this. Naturally, it would have numbers in it. But again, based on each purpose area that you've filled out an application for, then all of that information would be tallied in this budget summary, giving you an idea of all of the purpose areas that you're applying for federal funding. In conclusion, I want to say that there are some things that you want to be mindful of in reference to reasons why budgets do not clear, okay? So an application was submitted without thoroughly complying with the instructions. And what I mean by that is, let's just say that the instructions said that information regarding whatever it is must be in sections 1, 3, and 7. And you only put that information in section 1 and 3. If it's not in section 7 also, that application will be returned to the applicant. Unallowable costs. So remember when I started out that there's information on the website where you can get a look at allowable and unallowable costs. Narrative content is missing or it's inconsistent with the budget line items, okay? So we're saying that we're going to do X, Y, and Z, but the budget information that we have in there is supporting A, B, and C. So again, it's either missing or not consistent with the worksheet. And then finally, the federally negotiated indirect cost rate, if you're getting it from your cognizant federal agency, was not submitted with the application, okay? So those are some things to keep in mind as to why budgets don't clear prior to you submitting your application. At this time, I will turn the presentation over to William Faith from the COPS office, and he has some additional information for you in reference to the CTAS application.
Thank you, Michael. This is Bill Faith from the COPS office, and I'm going to be representing the COPS office today in terms of Purpose Area 1. We'd like to remind you that the webinar for Purpose Area 1 will be held on Tuesday, January 8th at 2 o'clock Eastern Time. So please visit the 2019 webinars page on the DOJ Tribal Justice and Safety webpage. Locate the Purpose Area 1 webinar and follow the instructions to register. The key goals of this webinar are to provide a general overview of CTAS Purpose Area 1. We will highlight key application and purpose area requirements. We will help you identify tools and resources that will facilitate the application process. And we will discuss how the current solicitation differs from CTAS solicitations from previous years. Also during this webinar, we will provide an overview of completing the budget worksheet for Purpose Area 1, identify some helpful do's and don'ts for completing the application and the budget detail workbook, and also provide an opportunity for applicants to ask CTAS-related questions. Please read through the entire solicitation before that webinar so that you can ask any questions that you may have at the end of that presentation. Listed here, you'll find some reference material that you'll find helpful for Purpose Area 1, as the COPS office has put together a couple of documents that you would like to have and bookmark, if you will. You'll also notice that the dates on here have not been changed. They do represent 2019. The links are actually current. So in the process of putting the links on there, the dates were overlooked. So it'll be the Coordinated Travel Assistance Solicitation, the Unallowable Cost List, Frequently Asked Questions, and you can find the COPS section from pages 21 to 28, the DOJ Grants Financial Guide, which is always helpful, and also for indirect cost questions, the Department of Interior has an Indirect Cost Services Frequently Asked Questions. The Purpose Area 1 CTAS Budget Detail Worksheet was recently redesigned to be more user-friendly and to reflect software updates. Most notably, you will find more instructional language throughout the worksheet. You are strongly encouraged to use the workbook when completing your proposed budgets. Fillable versions are available for download. Funding caps for Purpose Area 1 have been revised from last year. The COPS office will impose caps on FY19 awards based on the number of sworn officers as follows. Sworn force of fewer than 10, you can receive no more than $300,000. A sworn force of 10 to fewer than 20, you can receive no more than $500,000. And a sworn force of 20 officers and above, you can receive no more than $800,000. Be aware of the funding cap for your agency and understand that there is no local match requirement. Be sure to limit your request accordingly to stay under the cap. If you plan to request personnel, read all of the award documentation provided to understand the rules and regulations for hiring law enforcement officers, which also includes civilian anti-methamphetamine or anti-opioid coordinators. Maintain documentation that supports how your requested salary was arrived at and how the fringe benefit totals for each item were calculated. This will be discussed more in detail at the webinar for Purpose Area 1. Overtime has been added as an allowable cost this year and can be requested as a separate item in the Other category on the Budget Detail Worksheet. The caps for the amounts that you can request for overtime are as follows. If your sworn force is fewer than 10, you can receive no more than $25,000 in overtime costs. If your sworn force is between 10 and fewer than 20, you can receive no more than $50,000. And if your sworn force is above 20 or more, you can receive no more than $75,000 in overtime costs. Review the frequently asked questions for answers to some of the questions that relate to requesting overtime. If a request is made for an item that involves policy or procedure, as Michael has indicated, be sure to state the nature of the policy or procedure. That means, is it your own, or is it the federal policy that you're following? Be sure to follow those regulations as you create your budget and remain in compliance throughout the life of the award. If indirect costs will be requested, a current agreement must be submitted with the application. Expired agreements will be accepted during budget review. However, associated costs will be calculated using the expired rate and frozen until a current agreement is provided if you are awarded. I'd like to turn it back over to Michael now.
So this will conclude our presentation portion of this webinar, and we'll now turn it back over to field questions that have been submitted throughout the webinar.
Great, thank you. The first question is, how do you contact the program office for Purpose Area number 4?
This is James. If you need to contact the program office for Purpose Area 4, just send an email to tribalgrants@usdoj.gov, and the COPS Response Center will either give you the POC directly, or they'll forward the POC's information to you and they'll reach out to you. And that's the same for any of the purpose areas.
Thank you. For purpose area number 1, if we want to enter into a contract with an outside police department to have a sheriff on site at our reservation, what would that constitute? The funds would be used to offset the salary. It seems that would be an award to the tribe. Please clarify if that is not the case and if it would be a subaward or otherwise.
Currently, you are allowed to contract out for law enforcement help. In order to get that in direct answer and the correct answer, I'm going to refer that to a program specialist, and we will get that answer within the webinar for Purpose Area 1 on Tuesday the 8th. So if you could come back or send us an email at the address just given for the Cops Response Center.
I also want to go ahead and give the phone number for the DOJ Response Center, and that is 800-421-6770. And the email again is tribalgrants@usdoj.gov. So any questions can be referred to the Response Center, and they will put you in contact specifically with the purpose area representative that can answer your specific question. I want to go ahead and also give the GMS help desk number. So this is specifically if you have any questions about operating our grants management system. So any kind of technical assistance that may be required in negotiating that system itself. And that number is 888-549-9901. And there is an email for that one as well, which is gms.helpdesk@usdoj.gov.
Thank you. Are there any major and/or minor differences in the budgetary process from last year's submission that we need to pay particular attention to?
This is James. Some things that you do want to keep in mind. I know a lot of times applicants, if they've applied last year or the year before, they'll try to use a previous budget workbook. You don't want to do that. You want to use the one that we've provided in GMS for you, because every year we're making little updates to it. And there were some updates made to the form this year. For example, each purpose area tab, you can see the total at the bottom. That wasn't the case last year. There's also a field where it's been added where you have to put your tribe's name there, and that wasn't there last year either. So a lot of times it may visually look the same, but we've added little changes. So you want to make sure that you use the correct budget workbook. Make sure that you do list your tribe name. I would also encourage you, I know sometimes that the POC who did your budget may change from the time that you submit it until after. If that happens, reach out to the response center so that the appropriate program office can be contacted and given the correct budget POC's information, because a lot of times budgets are held up if we can't reach someone. So just make sure that you keep that information up to date.
Okay, so in response to the question of are there any major or minor differences in the budgetary process from last year's submission, the answer is there are no differences in the process from last year in terms of the budget.
Right.
Thank you. This question is in response for the additional information regarding the purpose area number 1 question. Is there a cap on the specific salary for a sheriff? We do not have law enforcement. We have tribal law enforcement. Is funding only allowed for entry-level law enforcement personnel?
That is correct. Entry-level law enforcement personnel salary. So whatever you have set your sights on for that, if whatever it's determined to be, you will be getting a grant fund for the amount of an entry level. Anything above that will be coming out of pocket for your local funds.
Great, thank you. Is there an Uber or Link ride allowable for transportation costs?
In terms of travel, they're going to want you to be as judicious as possible. If the Uber costs more, then they will frown on that. So if you're putting a cost in, just figure out how much a taxi costs or a shuttle, or just stay judicious with the amount of funds you're requesting.
Great, thank you. Is a partner that is written into the grant also a subgrantee? If so, do competitive requirements apply, Or is the entity a sole source contract, and how does that affect monitoring?
Let me say this in reference to partnerships, memorandums of understanding, and other titles that we use in reference to say that someone will be sharing the workload with us. According to the uniform guidance, and I talked about this earlier, they say that regardless of what you call the entity, if they are going to be sharing in the responsibilities, performing an aspect of that particular grant program, that makes them a subrecipient bound by all of the requirements that go with subrecipient monitoring, reporting, and other activities. So even though it's a partnership, the idea is that one entity becomes the lead entity, which is probably your organization, and then the partner that's working with you is the subrecipient. Based on a special condition, the deal is that all, especially in OJP, that all subawards need federal authorization. So when it comes, we will look at it at OJP and make sure that it's truly a subrecipient and provide any additional special conditions on how to handle that subrecipient moving forward. But again, it is a subrecipient requiring that based on the amount that I award to them, I may have to report them in FFATA reporting. Based on doing monitoring, yes, I'm going to have to do site visits in reference to that part of the requirement. So, like I said, whether we're talking about a partnership, a memorandum of understanding, OMB says they really don't care what we call that entity, but as long as they are implementing an aspect of that grant program, they are considered a subrecipient.
Great, thank you. And this question is to clarify from the Purpose Area 1 question regarding law enforcement. So to clarify, can we apply for the salary offset for the entry-level law enforcement employee and then offset the remaining balance out of pocket?
That is correct, as I read it, yes.
Great, thank you. And another question is, does the indirect agreement have to be current at the time of submission and not the grant period if we are awarded?
If a expired indirect cost rate is submitted with the application, what we're going to require you to do if it's expired is possibly take money out of the indirect cost because you have an expired rate. If it expires during the award period, at least it's still in there, but you don't want to submit an application with an expired indirect cost rate because in most cases we'll ask you to remove that indirect cost rate from the application until you get a current rate.
And to add on to that, the COPS office has decided that we will accept expired rates, reasonable, and we will freeze the amount. But if you're, the question indicates if you are current at the time of submission, then obviously you will be awarded the amount based on a rate for the current indirect cost rate agreement. To the best of our ability, we'll track and monitor that, and once it does become expired, we will put a freeze on the amount that is remaining for that cost. So until you get a new approved rate for the period that you're actually incurring the expense, those costs will be put on a freeze.
Great, thank you. Regarding the entry-level law enforcement salary cap, for those who wish to hire a more senior law enforcement officer, could you explain how one would enter that into the budget narrative? Say an $80,000 position, but cops will only fund $60,000. Would one put one FTE at $80,000, only receive $60,000, or would you enter 1.75 FTE?
No, you would not put 0.75 FTE. It was always a full, it always has to be whole numbers for the officers that you request. In your attempt to hire an entry-level officer, due diligence, but if you can't, then the cost would come out of your pocket, which is above the entry-level cost for the officer. You would track that entry-level as federal share, and you would track the portion above the entry-level as local share.
Great, thank you. Just a reminder, the due date and time for the fiscal year 2019 CTAS application is February 26th. All applications must be submitted by 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Those submitting a CTAS application are strongly encouraged to submit their application prior to the February 26th due date. Do any of the presenters or panelists have any additional comments to share?
I would like to thank my colleagues, Kim Smith and Melissa Harrington, for participating with me today.
This is James Smith. Just another reminder too, I know that sometimes applicants like to submit the budget in their own format. We strongly encourage you to use the template that we've provided. However, if you don't use that, we ask that whatever format you use, you make sure that you are still covering the same things that we're asking in the template.
And this is Michael Williams from OJP. I strongly encourage you, when you run into difficulties with the application, that you pick up the phone and reach out to someone for the assistance that you need. This will make the process not only easy for you, but it'll take that stress off you for waiting till a deadline in order to try to contact us because you were having problems. So I always say, if you have any questions, consider no question a dumb question, but always feel that we know that we're always here to assist and help you. So please, if you're having any difficulties with the application process, pick up the phone or send us an email so that we can help you.
We would like to thank you for joining us today. We hope you can join us for future fiscal year 2019 CTAS webinars. Thank you for joining.